Basically, I said something like in the arc of the Putin presidency, unlike a regular president or head of state, Putin doesn't operate in a 4-year period. He operates in decades. He operates like a pope or like the Queen of the United Kingdom.
Governor Romney, I'm glad that you recognize that Al-Qaeda is a threat, because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not Al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War's been over for 20 years.
The seasoned politicos in our audience might recognize Barack Obama's famous quip on former governor and then candidate Mitt Romney in a 2012 presidential election debate, back when America hoped to reset its relationship with Russia whilst pivoting towards the Asia Pacific. 2 years later, Russia annexed Crimea and sent little green men to back Ukrainian separatists, leaving that country in a state of perpetual civil war since. Over the past month, Russia has further escalated tensions, massing troops on its border with Ukraine. The Kremlin demands that the US never allow Ukraine nor Georgia into NATO, and that all countries that joined since 1997 be expelled from the alliance. In other words, Vladimir Putin wants to enforce a Monroe doctrine of sorts in its immediate vicinity that would leave Ukraine squarely in Russia's sphere of influence. As the possibility of armed conflict in the East becomes a distinct probability, we take stock of these tensions in the launch episode of Season 4 with the Atlantic Council's Vladislav Davidzon and Catholic University's Michael Kimmage, both returnees to the show. And don't forget that, as always, whether or not we continue to grow as a show is in your hand. You can join our growing group of generous patrons for as little as the price of a sandwich a month by clicking on the link on the episode description down below. We would also really appreciate if you could support us by writing a review on Apple Podcasts or by sharing the show with friends and family. We've got many wonderful projects for this new season, and we will need all the support you can get. Now, on to the show.
On one side of a line in DC, we have Michael Kimmage. Michael, you're professor of history at Catholic University, specialized in the history of the Cold War and of Russo-American relations more generally. You even served in Obama's administration in the US Department of State on the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. So I have to say this is quite relevant to our conversation. You published in 2020 a fascinating book, The Abandonment of the West, The History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy, for which we had invited you for the 6th episode of a podcast called Between Russia and the West. So I recommend you guys give a listen to it. It's a really fascinating blend of history and politics. Welcome back, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me.
And on the other side of the line, we have Michael in DC. And on the other side of the line, we have Vladislav Davidzon in Odessa. Vladislav is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. But Vladislav is a man of many talents, as he's also a co-producer for a TV show on the dissolution of the USSR, as well as a cultural correspondent for Tablet magazine. He's also another returnee on the show, having starred in episode 29, Europe's Pirate State on Belarus. And you've also recently published From Odessa with Love on Ukrainian culture and politics. I want to give a special shout out and thank you for Vladislav, who's taking a break away from his upcoming wedding in Odessa, where he's going to be meeting with the local mobsters and all the wealthy oligarchs of Ukraine. So thank you so much, Vlad, for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm just getting prepped for a Odessa society wedding, where the great, the good, the oligarchs, and the mafioso are going to be here. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Good company then. Well, Vlad, let's begin with you then. As I just said, you're in Odessa. How do the Ukrainians feel about the recent developments? How do they feel about the growing tensions between the US, in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine? Can you give us some insights on the ground? Do people in Ukraine feel like they're heading towards some kind of conflict on a larger scale?
Well, I just arrived from Kiev last night, so I just hit the ground running last night in Odessa, and I'm seeing my friends and some contacts. I wrote a piece in the Atlantic Council 3 days ago, which was basically a diary of how completely ambivalent everyone is here, and how amazingly they're able to compartmentalize and just ignore reality and ignore the drumbeat of war and ignore the drumbeat of bad international news. Basically, in Kiev, everyone knows what's going on and is ignoring it. Here, no one knows anything at all. It's like Odessa is its own little bubble, and no one has noticed anything. And I went to my friend's restaurant in the morning. She's a restaurateur, and she asked me a few questions, like, "Oh yeah, something's going on. You have news. You kind of know people." I said, "Yes." Who are you talking to? I just saw a famous conductor. I saw a couple of security people this morning, a couple of friends, had lunch with some other people. No one is concerned at all in Odessa. It's just the most amazing form of cognitive dissonance, you know?
And Michael, you're currently in DC. Does it feel like one on the verge of a major confrontation with Russia? How is the DC bubble reacting to the entire news story?
Well, the city of Washington, of course, is preoccupied with COVID and with a sort of recent bout of bad weather. So it's not on the tip of everybody's tongue in the city, perhaps in that respect, sort of similar to Odessa, but certainly the expert community is absolutely
Buzzing.
on edge. And the question here seems to be, rightly or wrongly, not whether there will be a sort of massive conflict, but just really when. Is it going to be this month, next month, or a little bit later on? So, DC is in a state of agitation of a kind that I've really never seen before.
Well, Michael, can you, before we go into the weeds of the whole situation, can you kind of paint a broad picture of what is going on between Ukraine and Russia? We've seen some 110,000 troops who've been massing up at the Russian troops massing up at the Ukrainian borders to do some kind of training exercise. What is going on? And also perhaps tensions have been ongoing since 2013. We remember the annexation of Crimea. We remember the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine. Why is Russia upping the ante now? So broad picture, and why is it escalating now?
Yes, these are excellent questions, of course, and maybe this speaks to what Vladislav was describing a moment ago in terms of a sort of mood of resignation among many in Ukraine. This war has been going on for a long time. It never ended. So it's now in its seventh year. So it's not that a new chapter exactly is beginning. This is the continuation of an unresolved conflict that goes back to the flight of Yanukovych, and as you say, the annexation of Crimea, invasion of the Donbass in 2014. So you have two things that are very notable, and that does make this situation new. As you mentioned, amassing of hardware and to a degree of troops, not just on Russia's border with Ukraine, but also on the border between Belarus and Ukraine, suggesting at least the potential for a ground invasion, a land invasion at 3 points, sort of from the north, from the south, and from the east. And you could factor in an amphibious landing, if you will, as part of that, sort of hypothetical scenario. So Russia did a military buildup in the spring of 2020, but this is much more substantial, and you've seen a kind of cycling in of soldiers, sort of toward the border in a way that's absolutely menacing. But that's not the only relevant detail at the moment. At the same time that Russia has done this, sort of from November till, sort of the last couple of days, what you've seen is the issuing of ultimatums to the West. And in fact, this did not happen in 2014. It didn't happen in early 2020. You had a kind of boring meeting between Biden and Putin in the summer of 2020 that didn't suggest that war was imminent. But in the last couple of weeks, Russia has issued a series of demands that NATO return to its 1997 configuration, that NATO expansion be sort of terminated, at least for Ukraine. And, I think most people look at these demands as so unrealistic that they seem perhaps to be just a pretext for waging the war for which Russia has created the capacity over the last couple of months.
Vlad, I saw in a recent article in Unheard, you were giving some context. And you had a very interesting theory for why Russia was upping the ante now.
Which is the theory you want me to elaborate on that theory. My pal David Patrikarakos wrote that piece. It was a very kind of him. He's a wonderful journalist, and he's spent a lot of time here. Really understands the situation very well. So basically, I said something like, in the arc of the Putin presidency, unlike a regular president or head of state, Putin doesn't, operate in a 4-year period. He operates in decades, right? He operates like a pope, or a pope, or like the queen of the United Kingdom.
He has outlasted a few popes, if I'm correct. He started with John Paul II. He waited out Benedict XVI, and now he's got Francis. He's more than a pope.
Right. So exactly right. He like the Queen of the UK. Yeah. He has institutional memory of 5 different presidents, 6 different prime ministers, 3 different popes. Right. And he has an arc of his historical career, which is 30 years as opposed to 4 years or 8 years for a lucky president or prime minister. So, in comparison to the historical arc of his presidency, he probably does see a president of the United States who he considers to be weak, who has signaled in all the wrong ways that they really want to reset, who has not been able to get Nord Stream 2 out of sight, who's not been able to really arm Ukrainians to the teeth, a foreign policy apparatus in the West Wing that really would like to concentrate on other things without going into what those other things are, would really prefer not to have to say nasty things publicly, but, would like to have a quiet reset. So, I didn't vote for President Donald Trump, and I do understand why so many people become maddened by President Trump. This is exactly the kind of thing Donald Trump was good for. Strategic ambiguity, table thumping, screaming about power, and scaring away revisionist powers through the adroit use of madman theory. That's exactly like the one thing that Donald Trump was really good at and good for was yelling, cruise missiles now, ground. That kind of thing is not what President Biden is good at or good for. And in some ways, it's much worse. I prefer actually the latter approach.
Madman theory, for those who don't know, is the idea that if you act so irrationally, people will be afraid to challenge you because they cannot expect you to behave in a kind of calculated, rational way, which was very important in kind of nuclear theory, where people thought, if I'm doing this, Nixon is going to go crazy and send the nukes.
Can I just say one thing extra? I grew up in Brooklyn, and when I was in high school, I used to play football on the Fred Trump Memorial football field in high school in South Brooklyn. And we understand Donald Trump for all his vulgarity and viciousness and immorality. We understand him very well where I'm from.
Michael, is there an end game here for Putin? He's putting a lot of pressure. You believe he could go even as far as invading parts of Ukraine. Is there a strategic objective here? Is he simply being opportunistic? He's testing the waters as a new American president. He has plenty of cash because the price of gas has gone up. Does he want a conflict? Is he bluffing to gain concessions? Is there some kind of domestic angle we are missing here that is driving his policy? How do we explain Putin's endgame? Is there an endgame? Is he just kind of trying to see how much he can get out of this?
Yes, I think that there's a clear endgame for Putin. It's at the minimum, it's sort of the neutrality of Ukraine in geopolitical terms. So let me just go back and add an alternative explanation to the one that Vladislav just supplied for the origins of this crisis. I wouldn't factor Biden in much. I don't think it makes a big difference. There hasn't been much of a change in Russia policy from Trump to Biden, and a lot of the problems got worse under Trump. I think from a Russian perspective, the timing comes from the growing military relationship between Ukraine and the West. It's really evolved quite considerably. And I think in the Russian calculus, I think Vladislav is exactly right. Thinking in terms of decades, if this trajectory is allowed to go on, Putin believes it's going to sort of put Ukraine entirely out of Russia's reach. So this is the window that he sees where he can do something about a geopolitical orientation in Ukraine that he doesn't like and feels that Russia cannot accept. So I'd put much more of a military logic, and I would also look to events within Ukrainian politics in the first 6 months of 2020 and a sort of growing frustration with Zelensky, and sort of localize the conflict a little bit more. I think Washington maybe is, of course, an important factor, but I don't think it's the pivotal one. So this, sort of in turn takes us to the question that you just posed, Francois, about what Russia is aiming for. And I think they have, sort of a suite of options that the military force has given them. One is just to exert so much pressure on Ukraine that Ukraine cracks. I think it's an unlikely outcome, but it's possible. Secondly, to exert so much pressure on the West that the West cracks, and that you'll get just a sort of backing down. And we can talk, a little bit later about Macron and France and, sort of Germany's reservations. But this is, again, I think not likely, but also not science fiction. And if that doesn't pan out, if the West sort of holds firm, I think what you'll see is a Russian effort to destroy the Ukrainian military, which is not necessarily entailing an invasion. That could be done from the air, and that could be done with missiles, or with cyber power and other tools, just to incapacitate the Ukrainian state, to make it incapable of functioning, which would serve the strategic end of rendering the country neutral. Would of course also, sort of destroy civilized life in Ukraine, but that's quite possibly a price that Putin is willing to pay.
Wow. Okay. So, Vlad, what do you think of the idea that Putin is ready to go all the way if necessary?
I actually do believe that he is not bluffing. I think he's well past calculated the costs in terms of international sanctions, the collapse of the Russian stock market, the collapse of the ruble fervor, the collapse of international reputation, the whether he could get the Germans back on side in a year with Nord Stream 2, how many dead Russians the Russian population can accept. Is it 10,000? Is it 500? Is it 30,000? I mean, they have done those calculations. I'm sure they have priced in every single scenario, and they've had 15 different scenarios that they're willing to cycle through, ranging from terrorist attacks in Kiev or Kharkiv or Odessa, and deniable counter infrastructure, EMPs, or just a cyber attack which could destroy the heating in the middle of winter for like a month and a half, all the way to apocalypses, taking half the country and bringing tanks in from Belarus down to Kiev, which a lot of people don't think can happen. But they could if they wanted to change a government and then step back. We could also do lots of things in between, ranging from taking Mariupol to taking Odessa to a land bridge to Kerch or a land bridge to Transnistria, annexing parts of Donbass, putting troops all the way up to the other side of the Kiev River. All sorts of options. I do think that they'll do something, just as the president, Russian word is ляпнул. I think he accidentally said what he was thinking in public. I don't think he's very good at controlling the words that come out of his mouth. Sadly, there's just a lot of frustration here over him not reading what was on the card, but actually going off reservation and saying what it is that the national security people are actually telling him. So, I do think that they will do something. And I don't think that they're going to take over half the country, because who wants to take the entire meal to digest in one big gulp with the partisan warfare that the Ukrainians are going to engage in? This would be really, really, really bad. It would be tens of thousands of dead Russians. I don't think he's going to take over half the country, but I do think it could be bad.
Vlad, you were making this funny but also very insightful point about how Putin is a Pope or Queen of England. He's here for a long time. I want to bring in my old IR student background here in the conversation. It's going to be useful for once. If you're that kind of leader who's been around for a long time, let's bring some game theory here, because I think European leaders probably think of these incidents as kind of a one-off game. whereas Putin probably thinks this as a multiple iteration game, thinking that the lessons drawn from this crisis will be impactful in the next crisis. Could the current pressure campaign on Ukraine currently be a first step towards similar intimidation campaigns in Ukraine or in other regions for the years to come? Perhaps what I'm trying to say is, will the lessons drawn from this crisis shape the way we approach and the way Russia approaches future similar incidents? Michael.
I think the answer is clearly yes, and I would go back, in this case, not Russian military actions in Ukraine in 2014, but to Russian military actions in Syria in 2015. So Russia moved in, in a way modestly, not with a huge commitment of ground troops, but with air power and a clear show of support for Assad. Any number of atrocities were committed in Aleppo and elsewhere, and no real resolution to the crisis has been found. There's no diplomatic solution in Syria. There's no resolution on the ground. It remains as chaotic as it was. But from a Russian vantage point, it was quite a successful operation in the sense that it won Russia leverage in the region through arms sales and other vehicles, but also won Russia a seat at the table. That you really can't do Middle East diplomacy now regarding Syria and other questions without factoring in Russia. So I think that's the template, that's the model. It doesn't map on perfectly to Ukraine by any means. And I think Russia, radical as Putin may be, doesn't want to turn Ukraine into Syria, but I think he sees diplomacy with the West as hopeless. He's not going to get what he wants through persuasion. The West doesn't agree. It's not going to listen. That's a dead end. And the diplomacy of the last couple of weeks kind of confirms that judgment, I would suspect, for Putin. So the question is, how do you rewrite the rules through other mechanisms? And so I think military force is really what Putin has, whether there's the threat of military force, which is destabilizing for Europe, or whether it's the implementation of military force. It could be Ukraine. Obviously Belarus is already being sort of integrated into Russia militarily and politically, and you have models for this in Georgia, Moldova. So it's not entirely new, but I think Putin is going to push the envelope much more because he's modernized the Russian military. He has more tools. And I think he's feeling, at the moment, this is just guesswork, of course, but I think he's feeling self-confident in part because of the results he reaped from the Syria intervention.
Vlad?
I would follow up on all of that and agree with it. I do think that he is doing extraordinarily well. I do think that he's playing a very bad hand in terms of economic and capacity, not military capacity. There's no military outside of the U.S. Army, except maybe the French and the British in Europe, who could stand up even for a little bit to the conventional forces of the Russian army. Except the Ukrainians, of course, who have built a tremendous war machine over the last 7 years. But it's certainly not in terms of air and naval power capable of standing up to the Russians. But they have built a defensive army, yeah, which is remarkable. They've done a lot in starting with zero or even with negative points on the board. It seems to me that we've already reached a kind of terminus in the process of the reconstruction of the security architecture. Belarus is now entirely within the Russian column, within the Russian military sphere. I mean, Lukashenko, there's no political solution yet, but his territory is now the territory of the Russian army, which was not before. He was, resisting that for a very long time, but kind of total assimilation into the Russian project. Even though the Belarusian Russian Union state is a very fudgy thing as a concept, you can really take it in any direction. I mean, if they are in a union state, so you can kind of parse that however you want, and you can structure that however you want. But now the Russian army is a threat to Lithuania and a direct threat to Poland. There are now Russian troops on the Lithuanian border again, and they are not going away. The entire northern flank of Ukraine is now open to Russian invasion, and it's much much closer from the Chernigiv northern border to Kiev than it is from any other place next to Lugansk or Donetsk. You could really get from the Belarus border to Kiev very quickly. I think I've driven once in 2.5 hours, 2 hours from Kiev to Chernigiv, and I think it's another hour to the border. It's really quick. You can really get tanks from the Belarus border to Kiev very quickly. That was not the case before. So, you know, Ukraine is now surrounded in a way that it was not several months ago. And Sweden and Finland are now making noises about joining NATO. This is a serious, serious, game-changing, architecture of security changing movement on the entire eastern flank of the European Union.
That is a fantastic segue to the question I had. Michael, you just wrote an article last week on the 17th of January in Foreign Affairs called Time for NATO to Close Its Door. Given what you just told me about the way Russia is acting, the thesis of the article is that NATO has gone too far, it's too big, too provocative for its own good. Isn't there a slight contradiction in the terms here?
I don't think so. I think that first of all, Ukraine is not going to join NATO, as I think basically everybody knows. So it's a strange dance rhetorically that's done around that question. At the very best, it's a distraction. At worst, it sort of gives Kiev false hope and gives Putin a lot of rhetorical fodder to use for domestic Russian politics. So it's a debit, I think, in almost every respect, that commitment. And then, secondly, this is what I try to flesh out in the article. Flesh out in the article is NATO is a defensive alliance, and it's superb at defending its members, as it would be if Lithuania is threatened, or Estonia, or Latvia, or Poland. It's really has 100% success on this track record from 1945 to the present. NATO is terrible out of area. It really failed completely in Libya. It recently, had a failed mission in Afghanistan. I guess you could say in sort of Yugoslavia that there was a success then, but it's been followed by a series of out-of-area failures by NATO. And I think NATO, as the defender of Ukraine, or as the sort of instrument in Ukraine, is just ill-designed for it. So there are many options for a military counter-response of the U.S., of its European partners, but I think NATO is just not it. So I think we clarify our side. It's not a concession to the Russians, in my view. We clarify our side by just saying NATO is there to defend its members. And of course, in the short term, even if one keeps the door open, and probably it will be kept open, but in the short term, Finland or Sweden or Ukraine in NATO is not going to be on the table, and it's not going to help us to resolve this conflict. So I think we benefit militarily from being rigorous about the defensive nature of NATO.
Vladislav, is the argument about NATO being a threat to Russia, how much is rhetorical fodder, or how much is actually deeply felt by Putin and the Russians?
Yeah, I never quite know how much they believe their own propaganda. And to a certain point, they do, and they are paranoid. And this government has become more and more Siloviki oriented. That word means military brass, or literally Silas force. So force users are Siloviki. So Putin has more and more reverted over the course of a couple of election cycles to his, let's say, normative instincts, what he grew up with, what he grew up around. He has become more and more reliant on conservative types with a more paranoid military streak in their worldview. So he has progressively given more and more space ideologically and within the cabinet and within his personal advisors to people who think like that. So, it's hard to say, what kind of information he gets and what kind of advice he gets, but it is obvious if you look at the long-term frame of the kind of people who are in his cabinet and his personal advisory circle, that there are more and more ex-spooks or more and more former military guys who see the world through a kind of military kill or be killed frame or lens. That's not good. On the other hand, I never believed that NATO's any kind of threat to Russia. I mean, the best argument that could be made against it, it's only 7% of Russian land that has NATO borders around it. These arguments that Russia is surrounded by NATO bases were always to be quite farcical, especially when NATO disarmed essentially after the end of the Cold War. I mean, they used to have like 110 battalions or 120 battalions ready to go to fight a tank war in the middle of Germany against the Soviet Union. They have nowhere near even 10, 15% of the capacity that they had 30 years ago. But it seems to me that the best argument that can be made for them is that, Russians' population centers are next to the European border and not so far from NATO bases. Of course, it's all nonsense because there's no military capacity in Poland or Estonia to invade the neighboring Russian military districts, which have like 140,000 troops in them, and they're entirely there as tripwires to get public buy-in from those countries once their troops are killed, in order to get the full-on military to come into Poland and Germany and fight Russian troops there. I mean, nuclear missiles, and the fact that we all have nuclear missiles makes those arguments moot. The the capacity to invade Russia from Estonia or Poland, to say again, is extraordinarily limited, right? So I never believe these arguments. I've always thought them to be specious and self-serving.
Um, I want to read an extract from Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Rebuilding Russia, which he published in 1991 as the USSR was collapsing. And while Solzhenitsyn welcomed the separation with the majority of the former socialist republics, the half Russian, half Ukrainian intellectual added that, and I quote, "All the talk of a separate Ukrainian people existing since something like the 9th century and possessing its own non-Russian language is a recently invented falsehood. We all sprang from precious Kiev, from which the Russian land took its beginning." And it's quite interesting because last summer, Putin released a long-form essay with very similar rhetoric about how the inhabitants of both countries are brothers and how the fight is a fratricide. Michael, I'm going to ask you this as a professor of history. Is this narrative grounded in history?
I find it sort of impossible to evaluate in yes or no terms. I mean, obviously there are lots of interconnections, that speak to imperial connections, language, religion, folkways, cuisine, culture, and you have the simple fact, which is meaningful for Ukraine and for Russia, that lots of people are intermarried. You mentioned Solzhenitsyn, but you could go through the leadership of the Soviet Union, Brezhnev and Khrushchev, Gorbachev, and others who had sort of intermingled Ukrainian-Russian families. So, if you wish to find connections, I don't think it's difficult. Those are rooted in real history. But obviously, both Solzhenitsyn and Putin give very tendentious interpretations of those connections that, as Vladislav would know better than I, are highly disputed among many in Ukraine, and sort of numerically, more Ukrainians have disputed those connections after 2014 than before. I mean, you could sort of ask about the question of the United States and Great Britain. Is the United States a child of Great Britain? Is Great Britain the mother? I mean, there have been Americans who have seen it that way, but there are many who would, sort of object to that reading. I think the key question for Putin is, what work does this do for Putin? These kinds of articles and these kinds of arguments. Obviously, it doesn't convince people in Ukraine. It's not just the British defense minister who thinks that this is nonsense. I think most people in the West sort of reject this reading of things. It just seems like a kind of neo-colonial arrogance on the Russian part. But I think it probably does speak to something close to a consensus view in Russia itself. Although many Russians who would say that Ukrainians are our brothers or sort of our close neighbors would also acknowledge that Ukraine deserves to have its political independence, and so that maybe wouldn't play into the kind of Putinist narrative, but it's one of the ways in which he shores up his foreign policy. And this sense in Russia of Eastern Ukraine in particular, sort of vestigially Russian or sort of authentically Russian, inevitably Russian in Crimea, that worked perfectly for Putin in terms of domestic Russian politics. And I think for much of Eastern Ukraine, that is kind of workable. So it's not the historical truth that should matter. It's sort of where this might help Putin to justify his foreign policy in the event of a wider war. And it's clearly a kind of cultural political factor.
Vlad, does it shape the psyche in Russia and in Ukraine, this kind of historical narrative of Old Rus and Kiev and the rest of that?
Look, Solzhenitsyn is a fairly ordinary representative of that particular kind of conservative Russian chauvinist worldview. There's nothing new about that kind of worldview. He was a greater Russian patriot, imperialist, chauvinist, whatever. Lots of people like Putin think the same. Probably, I don't know, I'm not a sociologist, maybe 60 to 70% of Russians think that way, certainly a majority. Certainly, the Russian opposition does not ever bother talking about Crimea because it polls at like 82% or 84% that the Russian population wanted that. Now, does 82% of the Russian population want a full-on scale war? If you really are brotherly people, why are you killing hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of your brothers? I mean, it didn't save anyone in Yugoslavia from not killing each other, but they were all intermarried also, right? Brotherly people get into fratricidal killing all the time. In Yugoslavia, again, didn't help anybody. The Bible starts with the Bible and ends of our brothers and sisters. This is a narrative that has lost its purchase on the majority of the Ukrainian population. There is certainly a divorce taking place between Russia and Ukraine. It is probably not something that is reversible unless you actually occupy the country, in which case you're going to have partisan warfare. It's not going to work either. But, I've written a lot about this. This is in my book. This is what From Odessa with Love is about. It is about the birth of a new Ukrainian political culture, often Russian-speaking, where the chains and the links and the markets, importantly, that have linked Russia and Ukraine for, let's say, 30 years as independent states are being dissolved, broken, and dismantled. So from social media, where you can no longer really be on social media in Russia and Ukraine, to trains and planes not flying and riding in between Russia and Ukraine, to film distribution and music distribution and book publishing, Ukraine is setting up its own independent economic, political, social, cultural sphere. That is an irreversible process. And for Ukraine, time is their friend. For Ukraine, every day that the country exists, it becomes stronger. It deals with its internal issues. It deals with corruption little by little, though it's a decades-long process. What Ukrainians need is time. As long as they have time, as long as things don't change, Russia's losing. And Putin sees this and he's becoming frustrated. That's why he's pushing now. For Russia, a normal situation in Ukraine, as normal as it can be in the middle of a long-term occupation and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder and all this, metaphorically and really just spread out through the population, that is for him a losing proposition. Every day that the state exists, it is strengthening. And every day that Russia is not able to resolve the situation politically or militarily, the further Ukraine gets out of their grasp. And Putin sees this very well.
It makes me think of what Milan Kundera wrote about for West, the kidnapped West, I think, where he makes a distinction between great nations and small nations. And small nations, such as Ukraine, for example, kind of solely focused on survival and are grateful that they exist. Whereas great nations like Russia, France, or the UK, in their national anthems, for example, will talk about glory, greatness, values, where small nations like Poland or Ukraine, in their anthems will say, thank God we're still surviving, still alive. So I thought it was an interesting distinction here. I want to go back to you talked about the political class in Russia being pretty united on this issue. However, it's not clear the case. It's also the case in Ukraine. You recently wrote an article in Foreign Policy on this issue, Vlad. But essentially, if I get it right, the former president and oligarch Poroshenko has just returned to Kiev to face treason charges. Can you walk us through those charges? Are they based in some kind of reality, or are they exaggerated? And kind of more generally, how does this political infighting weaken Ukraine in this ongoing political tension with Russia?
Yeah, that's a really bad situation, and it's really, as diplomats would say, the timing is unhelpful, right? So, not to get into the bloody details, but basically, President Poroshenko had greenlit at a certain point, allegedly, trade with Russian-backed separatist proxies for coal in the midst of a situation where there was not enough coal. I wrote, like you said, a foreign policy piece about it. Look it up. There's a lot of details on that. It's a specious case. He may have allegedly done other things that you could put him in jail for. Allegedly, if if any lawyers are listening to this is not the thing that, if I was going after him, this is not the case that I would be using, because the Ukrainian government never bothered to cut off trade with Russia anyway. Naftogaz collects transition fees for Russian gas and all this, and oil and all, and there's still business between Russia and Ukraine, and that no one says that Russian and Ukrainian citizens can't do business together. This is completely specious. You could put anyone in jail for anything, even though it's a political decision for him to have said no to particular coal shipments from South Africa, which was a political decision. It was a really cold winter, 2014-15. There was a war on. It was a small shipment. I think it's $54 million. What they're talking about. He wasn't personally getting rich off of this. This is a government tender for heating contract, and I mean, it wasn't like they were buying it directly from the Russian army. They were buying it, I think, through proxies, through the Ukrainian separatists. It was an attempt to link him to Medvedchuk. So it's transparently a political thing. It was probably put into operation long ago, as in like 3 months ago they made this decision, and they wanted to clear the second round field for the upcoming 2024 presidential elections. They were looking to, they were looking at the polls. They're very poll oriented, and the polling shows that President Poroshenko, former President Poroshenko, is doing better and better as time passes, and this president, who does come out of television, is really ratings oriented, and they wanted to clear the field before 2024, in this year, before 23, long way away. And a couple of months ago, this decision was probably made, and it probably has something to do with television, because there are 4 or 5 TV verticals, and that's how you get elected in Ukraine, as in lots of other places, as we know. And you get rid of Medvedchuk and his television stations, and then you get who's a Russian proxy. It's understandable to getting rid of him. They could have done it more legalistically and less using emergency counterterrorism powers. Then you start going after other opponents like President Poroshenko, and you are no longer reliant on Akhmetov's TV stations or Pinchuk's. I mean, Pinchuk's TV stations are friendly, and it's really the Kolomoisky TV stations that are really back on track once you're going after Kolomoisky's number one enemy, who's Poroshenko. So it doesn't look great in the middle of this situation, to say the least.
Michael, there's another political leadership that has been pretty divided about all of this. It's been the European political leadership, which seems struggling to create a coherent message. I want to point out one thing, which is Putin has insisted on scrapping the Normandy format, which was a format with France, Germany, Russia, and the US, because Russia just wants to meet one-on-one with the US, a la Cold War, if you want. It kind of feels like the EU does not really know what it wants to do in the EU's institution, but also the member states, not quite sure what they're supposed to do. They feel like spectators. Is this crisis making things very obvious that the EU remains a vegetarian in a world of carnivores, as the saying goes?
Well, as the author of a book titled The Abandonment of the West, let me start, despite the gloom of the title, on an optimistic note and mention all the things that are going right on the Western side and that don't always get as much attention as they deserve. It's implicit to what Vladislav was saying a moment ago, and it's also a theme of his book, that the West, Europe and the United States, has real magnetic power in Ukraine. It has a power of attraction that Russia doesn't have. And however many tanks Putin musters and however much air power he uses, he can't really change that dynamic. And that's very substantial. And, if Ukraine has time on its side, I think the West does as well on this level in terms of its attractiveness. So there's a kind of, sort of long-term built-in advantage or plus that the West has that's worth noting. I think also, if you look at the diplomacy of the last couple of weeks, on the economic front, it's fairly unified, and I think the message has been sent, to my mind, effectively that if Putin makes a big military move, there will be massive economic repercussions for Russia via sanctions. You could also say that there's some movement sort of on the military front with Britain, Canada, the United States, the Baltic republics, and others sort of upping their arms shipments to Ukraine, which is perhaps a symbolic act at the moment, but does send a kind of a message. So, it's not all fissures, cracks, problems, and tensions. There's a fairly unified front. You could just recall that in 2014, it took Europe 6 months to put sanctions into effect, and without MH17, the shoot down of that airplane, Europe might not have sanctioned Russia for the annexation of Crimea and invasion of the Donbass. So here we're getting a different sort of preemptive message, and that's helpful for Western policy. But clearly, if you kind of look to the other side of the ledger, I mean, Germany is hedging its bets. It's using very, very careful language about Nord Stream 2. And about sanctions. It obviously does not want to get involved in any way militarily. That's continuity from the Merkel to the Scholz governments, but is sort of a bit of a problem for the West. And of course, France yesterday floated this idea of a kind of alternative structure that Europe would build up with Russia. And then sort of, once they did it, they would consult with NATO, if that's a correct reading of what Macron was saying, which is, for Western unity, a very, very unhelpful turn of events. I think, to take a step back, the problem with Europe is not at all that it's irrelevant. It's relevant economically. It has an important relationship to Ukraine. Trade agreement that sort of sparked the crisis in 2013 with Yanukovych. That agreement was eventually signed and sort of solidified between Ukraine and Europe. But this is what I would say critically, not just of the present moment, but of the last 6-7 years. Europe has been very lazy about Ukraine. It felt no sense of urgency to use the Normandy format to try to resolve the situation. It didn't have the urgency to sort of increase its leverage through economic or military means in the last 6-7 years. And so it sort of wasted this time. And now Russia, in a very dramatic way, is upping the ante. And it's clear that Europe doesn't really know what to do. So it's like the check has come due for 6-7 years of, sort of not half-baked, but sort of half-pursued policies, and it's as if the moment of truth has arrived, and it's not easy.
We are reaching the end of our conversation here. I just want to kind of test you a little bit on trying to predict the next few weeks. How do you see this issue developing in the next few weeks? If you had to bet on it, if you had to kind of imagine a possible landing ground, what would it look like, Vlad?
I'm going to be pessimistic. I think the Biden administration is going to fold. I just think they're going to fold. I would, if I had to put money out of my pocket and put it on the table, and I love gambling. I love gambling. I would gamble that they're going to fold and that they're going to squeak through. I just, after Afghanistan and Nord Stream 2, and then doubling down on Nord Stream 2 and not fighting back against the complete lack of uh, interest in the Germans to say, we have to make sacrifices. I just don't see anything. I'm beyond angry at this administration. Let me be emotional. I don't like their foreign policy. I don't intend to vote for President Biden in 2024. I don't intend to vote for Vice President Harris. I'm just or anyone who serves in this administration. Not to say that I'm going to vote for Republican, but whatever. I think they'll fold. I do also think that the Russians will do something like blow up a missile base, or turn off the electricity grid, or I don't know.
Okay, Michael, what are you going to take him up on his bets?
Kind of. I don't think the Biden administration is going to fold. I think if they would have that as an instinct, they would have done it already. And instead, they've sort of gone in the opposite direction, have yielded to none of the Russian demands, have sort of, marshaled transatlantic support for Ukraine, such as it is. And I would agree with Vladislav that it could be much greater, but it's sort of consistent with the kind of commitment that was made to Ukraine in 2014. Sort of no real military role for the West, economic role, sanctions and such, but Ukraine sort of occupies this ambiguous place in Western strategy, and that covers the last three presidential administrations in the U.S. and spans a lot of different European governments. So I think that what you're going to see from the West is what you've seen in the last couple of weeks. There'll be a willingness to sort of listen to the Russians and to meet here and there, but the sort of West has answered already, and I think for that reason, it's going to be very hard for Putin to back down. I can't imagine. Putin has consciously put himself in a situation where he can't really back down without some incredible self-generated humiliation. So he's got to do something.
Like Hernan Cortes, who sank his ships while landing in Mexico. There's no going back.
Precisely, yeah. That's the only explanation for this kind of maximalist diplomacy. If it was about reducing military exercises in the Black Sea or sort of moving Western missiles 100 kilometers back, Putin could get that with much less effort. So I think he's after something much larger here. But let me just add as a sort of concluding note, and to sort of reverse the terms in terms of optimism and pessimism, I think that a Russian invasion of Ukraine could be the end of Putinism. There's so many ways in which it could fail and go wrong for Russia, and I think it's very possible that Putin in this situation is overconfident and over-reliant, as the U.S. was perhaps on the eve of the Iraq War, sort of over-reliant on military force as a lever. So it's not that I would wish this invasion upon anybody. I hope to God that it doesn't happen. But there are lots of ways in which it could be Putin's undoing. So that's the sort of that's the last comment that I would make in terms of what I think is going to happen. That there will be a military move, but I think by no means is it guaranteed to succeed for Putin, and could become a huge Vietnam, Afghanistan type situation, albatross around his neck.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Michael, for this great concluding thoughts here. Thankful both of you for this great overview of the situation. We talked about history, we talked about Solzhenitsyn, we talked about all those fascinating things. There was a bit of a spy scale moment where I asked you, what does Putin want? What does he really, really want? So that was an interesting moment as well. And I also want to make sure that in a month's time, whoever loses the bet, PayPal the other one and $10, because I think we've got a proper bet here. Anyways,
Deal.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Thanks a lot, Vlad. And thanks a lot for coming back on the show. And to all our listeners, I tell you, I'll see you next week. And Jorge will be back, don't worry. See you next week.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us, Francois.
Great. So Vlad Davidzon and Michael Kimmage are both out. What did you think about this episode on Ukraine, Francois?
A lot going on. First of all, I thought it was very interesting that essentially our correspondent in Ukraine, Vladislav Davidzon, was telling us he's in Odessa right now. He might have just left. But people on the ground didn't really change their lives around this. I also saw this very funny post on Facebook by a group of expats in Kiev Facebook group, where people were saying, I know the Russians might invade, but do you think the nightclubs will still be open in Kiev? So I think that's kind of a mindset right now, which is Ukraine has been under pressure from Russia since 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, with the little green men in the Donbass, with civil war, kind of trench warfare, frozen trench warfare, which gets hot sometimes in the east of Ukraine. So they've been living with this for a very long time. The question is now, why did Putin escalate? There's different reasons. There was an interesting debate, I think, between Michael and Vlad on what extent did the current administration in the United States, in the White House, play a role in the decision-making of Vladimir Putin. Michael said this has nothing to do with Joe Biden. This is Putin being opportunistic because there's structural shifts going on. He was going to do it no matter what. Whereas Vlad was quite angry at the current administration for being too soft on Ukraine and on Russia, and not giving enough support. It's not clear, but as Vlad said, Putin is like a pope, or even more than a pope, because he has outlasted 3 different popes. This is his 3rd pope. He outlasted 2 popes. He has this kind of institutional memory, which presidents do not have. So, a US president has a timeline of 2 years because that's when the midterms happen. Maybe 4 years if you're being generous. Putin doesn't have. He has elections. He still has to win them, but he's not constrained by that kind of process as much. So he can play the long game, and the lessons he is drawing from this crisis will inform the next crisis and where he acts. So it's not easy at all, and I'm still somewhat. I know the French is quite skeptical of some of the worries that the Americans have about a possible invasion. I think the French tend to be a bit more skeptical about this. But it's not impossible. I mean, and if it is a bluff, well, if you want your bluff to be as efficient as possible, you need to make sure it is as believable as possible, and therefore, making sure everybody thinks war is a distinct possibility.
Yeah, and I think, look, this is almost. I don't want to belabor this point. We've talked about this issue endlessly on this podcast. But if one thing should come out of this crisis, it's if this crisis serves to highlight something, it's the absolute necessity of a greater European ability to defend the continent on its eastern flank, right? I mean, and I think this points to Germany's role particularly, where Germany has been the country that is most staunchly opposed, the effort to build to get European countries up to meet their 2% of GDP NATO commitment. So I think, look, whether or not whatever happens in the Russian-Ukrainian border, whether or not there's a partial or a complete invasion, I mean, it shouldn't take an invasion, is what I mean. It shouldn't take an invasion for Germany to react and to fulfill its commitment to spend 2% of GDP on its defense. And it shouldn't take an invasion for European countries to realize that the age of American patronage is long over, and the American public, because this is not even just a matter of the American government, Republican or Democrat. This is a matter of the American public opinion. The American people are graduating away from this kind of like 1990s mentality of liberal imperialism, where American defense is projected out towards the Europe, and that America shoulders the defense burden for the European continent. The American people are no longer going to be voting for presidents that behave that act according to that playbook. So I think Europeans need to wake up, and they need to react, and there needs to be greater European responsibility for our defense.
But I think, Jorge, a lot of countries will actually conclude very differently from you, which is we need America to be closer to us. And they will see any kind of attempts for a greater European autonomy as an aggression against the United States, which will only risk increasing that rift with Washington. I'm not sure that's the right analysis, but I think that's a lot of countries, especially countries like Poland. It's not just Germany. Poland does not want anything like that, because it has considered its European defense is not whatever France or whatever strategic autonomy we end up with, their European defense is called NATO. It's called America. And so I do not think it's going to move the needle that much. It might a little bit. So we can rail against the Germans all we want. It's not only the Germans. It's also the Poles. It's also kind of Central and Eastern Europe, because these are countries which have a distinct experience of being invaded. France has done a lot in its history to protect Poland throughout centuries, but in 1939, the French did nothing while the Germans and the Russians carved up Poland, and then Poland stayed under Russian occupation, Soviet occupation for decades. So I think it's a trauma we can rail about, but it's something we need to understand in our calculations. I really recommend our listeners go give a read to Kidnap West by Milan Kundera, where he writes something which is really thoughtful, especially for us coming from France, Germany, the UK, the United States, countries which are focused on global influence, on values, and all these different things. Milan Kundera makes a distinction between small nation and great nations. He said that great nations like France, Germany, England, the United States, these are countries which know they will be around for decades, for maybe even centuries, and they act accordingly. They talk about glory, values, the rest of it. But for many countries, especially in Eastern and Central Europe, they did not have that luxury. Their focus was squarely on survival. And actually, if you listen to a Polish anthem, I forget the exact lyric, but essentially they say, "Thank God we're still alive," essentially. It's a huge distinction. When you're thinking about survival, you have a very different policy than when you're a great nation, you're talking about glory and values and all the rest of it. So this was our first episode of 2022 for our brand new season. And we want to take a little bit of time with you to walk us through some of the goals we have for the semester. As some of you know, we've opened our Patreon account last year, in November last year. And we first wanted to thank all our amazing patrons who have been supporting us. David, Isabel, Raphael, Martina, Nicola, Axel, Carol, Henry, etc., etc. Thank you so much for your support. We are reaching a point where we're going to consider having some paid tiers, which means we'll give special content to our patrons, special Q&A sessions. We want to make sure our patrons, for example, will know ahead of time who we'll be inviting. They can send us some recommendations of guests. They can send us some recommendations of questions, and so on and so on. We want to create a real relationship with our patrons because we have great ambitions for this semester, Jorge. We are creating a legal structure right now, so we can do some great and grand things. We can do some partnerships. We can do some more complicated events and stuff. So this obviously is going to mean we're going to need some financial support to pay for the equipment, to pay for the digital equipment we have, and so on and so on. So if you've been listening to a podcast for a while, if you end up being here most weeks, well, maybe that means you like the show, and if you want to share the love, you can do very simple things like supporting us on Patreon for the price of a sandwich, for €5 a month. That will be tremendously useful for all the projects we have. You can also support us through our Apple Podcast page. You can write a review there. You can publish a rating. These really help for the SEO, the search engine optimization, which makes our podcast more recommended to you on your various platforms. It's easier to find us online, etc., etc. So that really helps. Something else which we have for you, we created a Uncommon Decency website. So as some of you know, we've been publishing those episodes, those podcasts, but we've also been writing a lot of articles over the past few weeks and past few months, Jorge and myself. So if you want to both look back at all the episodes we publish, but also take a read at the many articles we publish, essentially on those same themes, on the French election, on strategic autonomy, on the energy market. We wrote a lot of interesting articles, I think, which you might want to explore. So if you want to support us on Patreon, there's a link down below. And if you want to check the website, there's also a link down below. It's very straightforward. Just go on the description of the episode and there should be a link for all of this. So again, plenty of great ambitions, great hopes. We are trying to aim very high for our guests this semester, so we could really use all the support we can get.
Absolutely.
So Jorge, on to a new year, on to many new hopes and new ambitions. And to all of you, I say, see you next week.
See you next week.